So what I'm going to do is I'm sharing work that is currently being revised for the Journal of Design History. And I want to share the work in its current form in the hope of getting kind of constructive feedback and having a conversation with audiences as well. This is work that it's new for game history, game studies, and I think it's fair to say this is research that's new for design history as well. So I'm cutting across different fields based upon these objects that I feel require us to kind of jump across different disciplines. So I'm following my object across different disciplines and areas of study as well. So I'm excited to see what you can offer, what you can add to this conversation. And what really kind of excites me about this particular research is that what I've discovered in the time I've been working on game history, and I think the first piece I published was back in 2004, is that we've made a lot of mistakes in terms of how we've done game history. We've relied upon a lot of more very general, descriptive, kind of Rankian types of historiography, primarily looking at lots of who, what, and when, and seldom the question of how has been addressed in game history. And I guess my polemics on doing game history is to understand a history of games being associated with general historical studies versus just being a sort of subfield within the field of game studies. So the game history that I want to help engineer or to embody or to be a part of is a game history that's looking at design history, cultural history, social history, histories of technology. And this is where I think there's a lot of sort of convergence around these different areas, what I'm going to share with you today. So as I read through this material, I'll also periodically step out of the paper and provide some additional commentary. I won't go too far away from my microphone either. So I'll kind of dip in and out of the paper to provide some commentary on some materials or some areas I'm trying to work on. Okay. Again, I'm sorry about my voice. It's the worst thing to do if you're an academic is to lose your voice, especially when you're on kind of a mini lecture tour. Okay. When discussed within game studies, the cabinet of the coin-operated arcade video game machine has been deemed a container to house electronic components or designated a package expressive of its game content. Both are understandable. The cabinet serves a utilitarian purpose. It safely presents to the public electronic components required to run a video game. It must be durable to protect its electronics during factory distribution, through operator route transport to installation within different locations, not to mention the general wear of play and vandalism. One thing that I found really interesting in writing Game After, I asked John Paul Dyson of the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, what is the biggest concern about putting original coin-op cabinets on the floor? What is the concern when visitors are going through? And he said strollers. Strollers are the concern because they will come into contact with the body of the cabinet. And also from the point of view of many collectors who I interviewed, the biggest cause of damage to the integrity of the coin-op itself are mops, janitors' mops in old arcades when they're cleaning floors. Now these are things I would have never thought about in terms of having some active shaping on the artifacts that I'm invested in the context of game history. Like the back glass of its pinball predecessor, cabinet packaging actively advertises the game, its marquee, which is often backlit, bezel, that's the plastic membrane shielding the machine's monitor, control panel, front panel, and sides may contain topography, color, and imagery to attract would-be players. In the above description of package, it is the noun form of the word that predominates in the field of game studies. The verb form implies other variations. It denotes a process to make into a package and a means to present a product. This form of package encourages investigation into the history of coin-op cabinet design to better comprehend its industrial and graphic design while gaining insights into how both assisted in the presentation of the then new medium of the commercial arcade video game. I do want to state, though, that if cabinet as package remains prevalent in game studies, then the field does not presently possess a sufficient vocabulary to parse the design history of its artifact. Within game studies, the term game design involves the creation of content and context of a video game. Rule systems, narrative, characters, levels, audio, interface, and gameplay fall under the rubric of game design. It's a very reductive approach, of course, I'm giving you. Game development accounts for design practices rendered on screen. Game design for software and adherence with platform constraints and platform support. This usage of game design, the very typical usage of game design, it runs cold, I would say, when asked to attend to the industrial design of consoles, package design of software products, let alone graphic and industrial design of cabinets. A more encompassing recognition of design is called for to complement the prevailing game design so that other actors and practices can become meaningful to game history. Video games are complex and wide-ranging, and our scholarly engagement with their design history ought to be as well. I guess if there's a polemic in this piece, that's it right there. The game design that this work, I feel like I'm going through puberty again, sorry. The game design of this work begins to probe is one that encases the monitor, a study fixed on the surface of coin-op arcade video game machine cabinets. When broached historically, game historians typically recite the birth of the video game phenomenon, starting with the futuristic, and I'm putting scare quotes around this word for a reason you'll see later, the futuristic design of Nutting Associates Computer Space from '71, trivialize the past, the unusual boob controllers of Atari's Gotcha. This was Atari's way of trying to combat a phallocentric joystick when it comes to gameplay. Atari felt it could attract female gamers if it gave them controllers shaped as women's breasts. Obviously, this didn't work. These were designed by George Farraco, who was the first industrial designer that Atari hired. Or to celebrate industry success stories, of course, Atari's Pong. Or the cabinet is ignored altogether when the word game is allowed to assert medium specificity. Such topics are in lieu of the fact that very little scholarly work exists on arcade video game cabinet design in general. The most basic of questions have not been asked or have not been addressed to any real effect. Did relationships exist between game designers and artists responsible for the overall look or style of the cabinet? How did individual coin-op companies or divisions organize and manage their art departments? And what was the conceptualization process for illustrating the actions and themes of a game played upon a modified television? Rarely have more complicated questions been dared, questions consonant with the role and function cabinet design and artwork serve in defining the game. So these are ontological questions I think are being asked here. The phenomenology of historic play and the human embodiment of material technological coin-op artifacts. After all, coin-ops are convincing exemplars of interaction design before the term was even coined. It is time to unpack the cabinet, I would say, the medium that has delivered video games to the public and once stood as the standard. Okay, I think we often forget this, that arcade games were the standard for interactive electronic play up until the early 90s. The 90s are a particularly important period because the chips in the arcade games are often the same chips housed in the software and hardware for consoles. So the home market caught up to the public market. My basic position in the critical historical study of games, one in accordance with concerns expressed by curators in game preservation, as well as having some overlap with platform studies, is that more exists to games than what appears on screen. Whereas platform studies digs down to the code or to the metal in its vernacular, I-scale surfaces made of wood, plastic, glass, cardboard, and fiberglass. Forms molded and adorned to help constitute the game, as well as the experience of play. Forms anything but neutral, far from uniform. You might say that I study hardware and hard wood. In researching game history, I treat material culture studies, museum studies, histories of technology, science and technology studies, and most pertinent here, design history. Not as neighboring fields, but this is a cooking metaphor, but as binding ingredients for the cultivation of a game history mindful of method, theoretical analysis, archival research, and of course, artifacts. Game histories will benefit greatly from the wide spectrum of attention that design history applies to product concept and development, process and practice, production, consumption, use and users, failure, sustainability, and disposal. the general ebb and flow of things as they move through their life histories. Likewise, design history studies the materiality and materials of industrial and product design to better understand and explain social and cultural experiences between people and design things within the everyday. This is precisely why I offer the rather cumbersome phrase, coin-op arcade video game machine. It's quite a mouthful to say. The phrase methodizes the video game, the electronic computational or transistor-to-transistor logic system, display device, controller interface, and power supply as part of a greater whole. Machine accounts for the entire material apparatus, rather than privilege only its electronic components. A component like the cabinet is regarded as constitutive of the meanings, experiences, and functions of the machine, much like the circuitry used to run its game. The goal is to better understand all of these things. So on one hand, I'm very interested in a holistic approach, but one that also appreciates these individual components and feels that these individual components constructing the machine have histories that have not yet been told. My remaining words case arcade cabinet design with attention to machines produced in this particular talk from 71 to 79, before color monitors and multicolored graphics became prevalent. The aim is neither to edify artists nor exalt a general design aesthetic, but to learn how cabinets co-shaped their games, restricting myself to a period before the so-called video game craze hit full swing with its major stars on the horizon, and with the design paradigms of older electromechanical games, and I'm just going to say EM for short, still prevalent, provides a look into machines whose cabinets played a much larger role in filling in the gaps, when the modified TVs behind the bezel still radiated in black and white. Technological constraints compelled cabinet design to play a contributory, if not constitutive role in defining the game and gameplay. That would be my thesis. I close with a brief introspective discussion of the particular problems facing the research of coin-op history, while signaling the importance of design history to the critical historical study of video games. Excuse me. I hope you can hear okay. Sorry again. Part 1, Toward the Design History of Coin-Op Cabinets. Bill Kurtz's The Encyclopedia of Arcade Video Games opens with a bold claim. 1971 is hailed as the year that everything changed with the introduction of Nutting Associates Computer Space. A strange-looking game began to appear in arcades, Kurtz recalls, in contrast to pinball and other types of electromechanical games, like shooting and driving games. Nutting's machine must have looked a so-called space oddity, without flippers, plungers, and cabinet artwork stenciled upon its surfaces, especially with its statuesque yellow or metallic flake structure pedestaling a General Electronic black and white television that replaced the more familiar enclosed mixed media playfield of EM games. Kurtz's book is a collector's guide, and he can be forgiven for such overzealous decree of change attributed to a single catalyst, even when boasting a computer brain box, though built entirely of dedicated circuits based on TV technology. His narrative, however, is not that far from how many writers of game history account for the history of coin-op video games. An invention and innovation beeline advancing from computer space to Pong through Key Games as Tank, and Key Games was a kind of fake rival company that Atari invented when actually it was Atari, to Atari's breakout, and then to include with indefatigable stories of 100-yen coin shortages in Japan sparked by the popularity of Tato's Space Invaders and the fever caused by Pac-Man. This sort of beeline still dogs game historiography when it comes to looking at this particular era of coin-ops. Game history is yet to shake itself free from its own version of design history's Pevsnerian past. Like Nikolaus Pevsner's Pioneers of the Modern Movement, originally published in 1936, writers of game history have tended to ply their craft in a tradition of memorializing great men, inventors, innovators, designers, entrepreneurs, and often celebrate the games they built as good design, or at least exemplary of technological improvements. Cultural historian Erkki Hutamo, as is well known, has denominated such writing as chronicle, one devoted exclusively to recapitulating landmarks, breakthroughs, and founding fathers. On account of this, the task of the game historian has been restricted to that of chronicler of game designers, game companies, and their accomplishments. Hutamo's insistence that video game historians broaden their view to a longer history of pre-digital games and account for EM antecedents to video games is a perspective that I'm going to embrace and will periodically revisit before I suggest another direction for the design history of game artifacts at the end of today's talk. What is clear from Hutamo's critique of histories of games written in the first decade of the 21st century, as well as the game historian's bullish prerogative of maintaining hierarchical pretenses when writing history, is that such persistent chronicling omits other actors from contributing to the intricacies of game histories. Excuse me. Premising the history of coin-op machines solely on their technological capabilities smacks of technological determinism as a master trope for the writing of this history, while negating the influence non-computational or even non-electronic components play. What would Space War be without its cabinet? A naked assembly of a store-bought television set, 3 circuit boards, a coin box, power supply, and a cooling fan. I'm not suggesting that we operate with such severe separations, but urge those interested in this era of game history to attend to all actors that shaped the medium when the proper noun video game was still a neologism. It's equally troubling that such linear narratives of technological progress fail to consider how the coin-op arcade video game gained its cabinet form. Setting aside the heroic tale of Nolan Bushnell scurrying off in solitude to sculpt a miniature clay model for Computer Space's cabinet, video game cabinet design had a predecessor in EM games built within large upright cabinets. Henry Lowett is correct when he claims that the modular configuration utilized in the internal cabinet of Computer Space would remain essentially unchanged for generations. This does not preclude, though, that Computer Space was far removed from design assemblies of the prevailing generation of EM cabinets. Tech journalist Benji Edwards posits a comparison overlooked when proclaiming the change wrought by Computer Space. Computer Space, he writes in his blog, sported a display on top, controls in the middle, and a coin box at the bottom in an all-in-one stand-up unit similar to electromechanical arcade games such as Sega's Missile from 1969. Missile utilized a stand-up cabinet as opposed to the more typical horizontal cabinet of pinball. We tend to forget pinball needs gravity. The cabinet has to be on a sloped angle. Nearly every inch of the large cabinet's Formica-like coated surface is graphically illustrated to convey, i.e. package, the theme of the game. Players controlled a motorized model tank to fire light gun missiles at airplanes whose image was looped on a film strip projected within the cabinet. It was not a video game by any stretch of the imagination, and it looked nothing like Computer Space. Its cabinet design, both internally and externally, nonetheless still offers much to the study of video game history. Hutamo maintains that the shift from EM machines to video games was not a clean rupture, but more of a continuity, whereby physical interfaces, an assortment of controller devices, as well as game types already existed in pre-digital arcades. Here's a couple of examples. For instance, precursors of Midway's 1977 arcade video game machine Seawolf can be found in its EM Sea Raiders and Sea Devil. Such a claim is not limited to game type, but resounds for cabinet design as well. Sega's Missile, Midway's Sammy, which is surface-to-air missile interceptor from 1970, shares similar cabinet artwork, not to mention game concept, with Atari's really well-known arcade video game Missile Command. This observation is important to understand the coin-op industry during this era in particular. Atari's design ethos, to understand this era as well as Atari's design ethos. Atari, founded in June 1972 by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, fresh from the work on Computer Space with Nutting Associates, did not have a history of EM machines like many of its Chicago-based soon-to-be rivals. This meant that the newly founded company did not possess a stable of existing EM game cabinets to serve as design templates for the integration of display monitors and television circuitry to run a game. Instead, Atari designed the cabinet for its launch title, Pong, from the ground up. Pong's cabinet is of a modern, minimalist style compared to what was declared gaudy and old-fashioned upon its arrival. EM machines more at home in rambunctious boardwalks and game rooms than hotel lobbies, restaurants, and kind of posh cocktail lounges. The machine's cabinet design is boasted a lone but bold color and juxtapositions to its dark wood grain veneer that also added an earth tone to this new technological artifact entering our everyday spaces. Pong expanded the social and commercial spaces available for coin-op amusements. In doing so, Atari aimed to distinguish its machine from pinball. And this is expressed both in terms of the type of game that it displayed conjointly with its cabinet design. I mean, one argument I would make is that not only is the fact that we've got a game built on television technology, but one of the key successes of this game was not just the minimal instructions and the fact that it was a fun game to play, but this particular design expanded the market for public amusements. That these machines were placed in the public spaces where previously pinball and large electromechanical games did not have a market for. So I think the design played a huge part of expanding the coin-op industry. Many so-called ball and paddle games adopted a similar aesthetic. Veneer wood grain siding replaced the stenciled artwork found on pinball and EM machines like Missile, while illustrated bezels were used on fleets of so-called Pong clones manufactured by, and these are all Chicago-based companies, Allied Leisure, Bally, Chicago Coin, Midway, and Williams Electronics. A video game cabinet with wood side or wood grain sides gained entrance into locations not typically reserved for these large, graphically boisterous EM games. Location is a constraint in the planning of cabinet design and often determine the overall look of the machine. Here's an interesting example, and I know you can't see the fine print, but I'm going to highlight one passage here. Although not a ball and paddle game, Formula K's promotional flyer, this is from '74, makes this point well. In addition to the machine's 23-inch Motorola monitor and mimetic steering wheel controller, the cabinet is extolled. Tasteful wood grain cabinet can be placed in all plush locations. Side artwork on Atari's products, mainly stencils of game titles in the early 70s, did appear 1 year after with the release of Pong and Gotcha and Super Pong in '74. Yet Atari kind of was restrained from fully embracing the design typical of older EM machines for its new arcade video games. Lack of cabinet artwork on Pong directed all attention to the television monitor, glowing with the promise of something new compared to pinball or EM games. Playable images displayed on the monitor perhaps might have been considered the art of the cabinet. The monitor was installed upright, as if viewable from a tabletop, and not oriented at a 45-degree angle, soon typical of a number of coin-op cabinet design. The bezel for Pong exaggerated the size of the machine's 13-inch television screen. I think this is a really important point, and when I teach game history, I like to tell my students that some of the screens they have open on their desk are bigger than the screen that they would have played with Pong in 1972. And these were store-bought. I mean, they basically were putting TVs into wooden cabinets. The matte black recess behind a larger wooden shroud sucked in the viewer's perspective, giving the impression the playfield was much more profound than it actually was. Phosphorus shapes like a bouncing ball Atari may have felt did not warrant additional packaging. This period was short-lived, though. By the mid-1970s, most likely due to increased competition from other manufacturers as well as the expansion of Atari's art department, Atari released Stunt Cycle with a topographic marquee and accompanying illustrated side artwork. Illustrated bezels also became standard design on key games as Tank and Tank 2. One thing I find really interesting with Tank 2, this was a George Opperman. He was the head of the graphic design department. He did a lot of the artwork on Atari's games as well as their promotional material. I just love the fact that you have this kind of mid-'70s kind of sunshine pop that's being used on war games. So you've got all of these kind of happy pink and purple clouds for a game like Tank 2. I guess I'm assuming that's meant to be an explosion, but you've just got this sort of era of late modern, pre-postmodern graphic design that Atari is really embracing and doing some really interesting, unique, sort of visionary artwork for its cabinets. So I always think this is like a hippie tank game in many ways. So where were we? Okay, by 1979, you notice something radically different takes place. The stained wood siding is completely gone. Atari's bezels, marquees, and cabinet sides dripped top to bottom with highly detailed sci-fi fantasy illustration for the likes of games such as Lunar Lander and Asteroids. Although computer technology began to redefine the coin-op industry, design paradigms of EM machines persevered, continually imprinting their influence upon video game cabinets, even once socket holders protected microchips on a printed circuit board. The 1970s was a period of hybridization in coin-op design, and the style of EM cabinets supported the technology of arcade video game machines. Accounting for coin-op machine design within the broader history of electronic games and not just the introduction of television technology into amusement machines, we quickly realized that the past is a lot less tidy than game history's presiding beeline would have us believe. Accepting this, I think it's fair to say that computer space was not the only game in town in 1971. Whereas Nutting's machine displayed intergalactic battle across its televisual playfield, Chicago Coin's twin rifle gave its players a realistic, full-dimensional hunting ground, not displayed on a black and white television, but created by blow-molded plastic, black lights, fluorescent paint, and mirror trickery. A manufacturer of mechanical and EM coin-op amusement machines since the 1930s, Chicago Coin's machine is the antithesis of computer space. Yet a number of its design elements, fairly common to the era of EM games, became features translated into coin-op arcade video game machines across the 1970s and well into the 1980s. Players used mounted wooden guns to test their skill against mechanical fluorescent pop-up targets interspersed across the playfield set within a 72-inch high, 40-inch deep, and 31-inch wide cabinet. Computer Space's fiberglass cabinet may have given the impression, as Benji Edwards exclaims, that it was a molten dollop of technology, whereas Twin Rifle reached backwards to the older technology and techniques of the magic lantern and diorama. Players dug their shoulders into the butt of a rifle to line up targets through a bezel resembling pinball backglass. Its bezel artwork, while informative and instructive, also served to thematically frame the playfield. Forest imagery applied to the bezel foregrounded the game's setting, adding depth to the internal playfield housed behind the bezel. Players shot, with their mimetic controllers, they shot through a narrow tree-lined, transparent rectangular section of the bezel at targets within a painted panoramic landscape playfield, illuminated by black lights and given the illusion of depth by mirrors. We play a reflection when we play this game. We play a reflection. The playfield is located in the actual front bottom of the cabinet. So the playfield here is located on this part of the cabinet where we're shooting at a half mirror. Like a diorama, the cabinet's lower interior sides are illustrated to depict a land and cloudscape. Multi-scaled model trees texture the fluorescent blow-molded plastic to provide a detailed geological terrain of rugged landforms, a lake, foothills within which targets spring up. Inside coin-op arcade cabinets, plastic moldings provided scenery for EM playfields like Twin Rifle. This mode of augmenting a playfield within the internal space of the cabinet continued with the integration of monitors into coin-op arcade video game cabinets. Such an arrangement between video game and EM machine industrial and graphic design is evident in Midway's Boot Hill, and this is from 1977. The machine utilized an Intel 88 CPU with a black and white monitor for its Western gunfighter game. When standing at a Boot Hill machine, its 23-inch monitor is housed upwards at a 20-degree angle, directed away from the player and positioned into the cabinet. Unlike Pong, the monitor does not occupy a player's direct line of sight. Monitor output is reflected onto the cabinet's plastic playfield by a 45-degree angle half silver mirrored. Half of the monitor's light passes through the mirror, while the other half is reflected to converge monitor output with plastic playfield. The output image appears superimposed on the perpendicular playfield illuminated by black light, with its graphics glowing due to fluorescent paint. The effect, sorry about this image, I wanted to have one image I could at least show you what it looks like to play this game. The effect is two phosphorus gunslingers shooting it out in an Old West setting. Players control the on-screen movements, but essentially play a game in reverse. a reflection projected onto scenery providing graphic details to an otherwise monochrome game with rastergraphic pixel pattern figures. Without the cabinet's plastic background, the player would only navigate their characters around a quadrant of a 23-inch monitor controlling white phosphorus images on black. Perspective was achieved by a vanishing point, the illustration of a cemetery perched upon Boot Hill, with the sun setting in the distance and neighboring structures positioned in the foreground for scale. Boot Hill's cabinet assisted the technological constraints of its game to boost a full-color playfield. In this context, the cabinet is far more than packaging and container. It's a crucial part in defining the actual game. The container becomes content in this instance. This claim is realized further with Vector Beam's 1979 machine, Warrior. Tim Skelly built the game using the Vector Beam development hardware engineered by Larry Rosenthal and first applied to Cinematronics' best-selling game Space Wars from 1977. The use of vector graphics, geometrical points and line segments, as opposed to the more prominent raster graphics display system for coin ops, was, as Skelly mused, fantastic for rotating objects on screen. The objects in question are two sword-wielding figures inspired by the fantasy fiction of Michael Moorcock's character Elric, the albino emperor whose famed sword Stormbringer, if anybody played Dungeons & Dragons in the 1970s, this was required reading. Stormbringer swallows the souls of those its blade strikes. Warrior presents its fighters via an aerial perspective. We see heads, upper torsos, and arms swinging swords as we duel within the confines of a monitor. This was the first fight game. The machine's 19-inch monitor is positioned upright at the center of a cabinet and faces out towards the player. As with Boot Hill, the monitor itself only displays the score and player character figures. The playfield background consists of artwork depicting 4 stone staircases, ramps, and 2 pits housed within the castle. The scenery is reminiscent of blacklight poster fantasy artwork of the era. Ultraviolet light lending an eerie yet fantastic glow of the games, or to the game's brilliant vector display, adding layers of vibrant color to a game lacking true RGB color graphics. Now, just to give you a sense of this, so at the Strong, I was able to have the cabinet deassembled. So this is me standing here with the camera, with the bezel removed, shooting into the interior of the cabinet. What you see right here is the mirror, so it's reflecting graphics. See at the very top, you see these little squares. Those are the pits, and on the top of the interior, you have cones where they actually go up to show the depth of the pit. What it looks like in the game is this. So you've got the interior upper reflected to the bottom of the game, where we then have the monitor superimposed on top of it to give the impression that these player characters are actually occupying a scene or a setting within the game itself. The depiction of pits provided pictorial context for the actions of player characters. The action of a player character falling into a bottomless pit was achieved, according to Skelly, by scaling down the size of the character. This was far from seamless, as the vector image would remain at its usual level, even when appearing within the artwork of the pit. The machine's playfield is less decorative than contextual in this instance. Warrior attempted to strategically sync its monitor output with that of its playfield artwork to give the illusion of player characters ascending stone stairs or descending to their deaths. For Warrior, Skelly enlisted the services of comic book and fantasy artist Frank Brunner, known then for his Bronze Age work on Marvel's Doctor Strange and Howard the Duck, along with horror illustration for Warren Publications' Vampirella. Brunner is also esteemed for his illustration of warriors like Marvel's Conan and Red Sonja, as well as his artwork for Heavy Metal magazine, depicting, not without coincidence, Moorcock's cult character Elric. Brunner is responsible for the playfield artwork as well as the cabinet's exterior artwork. An artist of fantasy was commissioned to ply his trade to a coin-op arcade video game machine programmed for swordplay. Without his contribution to the playfield, Skelly has stated that this game would just look like 2 piles of angry glowing sticks. I can extend that sentiment to the cabinet's exterior. Without Bruner's commercial artwork, it would look like a large nondescript wooden container. Warrior's side art consisted of large stickers instead of silkscreen images attached to its all-white sides. What subject matter for cabinet illustration can be translated from glowing sticks? George Opperman, who, as I said earlier, directed Atari's coin-op graphic design department, as well as produced original artwork for machines and all of Atari's promotional materials, explains that an illustrator must be able to translate that blip into something, a character, a monster, a design, an abstract symbol. The translation of Warrior's sword fighting theme must have come easy for an illustrator who previously lent his hand to the savage sword of Conan in '78. Swords and sword fighting fiercely punctuated the action of gameplay across the contours of this particular cabinet. Side art illustrated the game's content in bold comic book style with a 3D effect of the game's title, Warrior, heading a fantasy scene of two warriors with swords locked in some type of cosmic combat. The stone interior of the playfield leading to a castle set ominously in the distance, and battle-worn skulls finalized the image. Bruner's signature appears towards the bottom of the scene, a practice uncommon on cabinet artwork. It's very rare to see any artist, with the exception of pinball artists, who would actually sign their artwork. We could say that Bruner's signature appears on every surface of this game. The amount of illustration on the vector beam cabinet is staggering. Players peer through the plastic membrane of a bezel adorned by flames. Even the playfield artwork is surrounded by interior cabinet artwork to further immerse players within the world furnished by the cabinet. I think there's some interesting metaphors at work here. Skelly gives full credit to cabinet artwork for promoting the games to potential players, and this supports the notion of the cabinet artwork as advertising. To conclude here, though, misses his most important insight. Writing on Bruner's artwork for Warrior, Skelly insists that it helped to flesh out the bare bones of early, primitive video game graphics. Like the output of its mirrored monitor display merged with hand-painted playfield graphics, cabinet and video game coalesce to form the game of the coin-op arcade machine. So I'm going to end this part of my talk by saying that Boot Hill and Warrior are not cherry-picked examples, but indicative of a general design practice of coin-op video games throughout the 1970s, a practice that regarded the machine's cabinet not as a neutral container, but as an active instrument for gameplay. One of the most iconic arcade video games of all time also utilized the mirror projected technique coupled with playfield artwork, Midway's Space Invaders from 1978. Perhaps it's difficult to accept this when cultural memory and MoMA have ostensibly colorized the game's graphics. Space Invaders did not utilize a color monitor for its game graphics. The machine's 19-inch black and white monitor was recessed within a very large EM-like cabinet, and like Boot Hill, utilized a mirror to reflect its phosphorus output displayed upon an illustrated lunar background. The inclusion of color graphics resulted from color cellophane applied directly to the monitor. This is the back of a Space Invaders cabinet with the back panel removed. This piece here is a concave piece of illustrated cardboard that's just stapled inside the cabinet. This is when it's removed. This is that kind of celestial illustrated background for Space Invaders. This is the monitor. These are the two straw pieces of cellophane tape that gives the impression of color when playing this game. Furthermore, the machine's bezel aligned with the background artwork akin to Twin Rifle's bezel to provide a 3D effect to the play space, while detailed color illustrations of space monsters, a laser cannon, and lunar craters penetrated the transparent frame to help intensify intergalactic action. Nearly 10 years after Pong, Atari's Warlords incorporated the painted cardboard found previously on Warrior, as well as multicolored overlays so that its black and white monitor reflected its output upon its battlefield scenery. What I found really staggering is you've got this giant, thick piece of plastic that colors the monitor, just on there, held together by masking tape. So, I mean, there's this kind of ad hoc assembly that you find on the inside of these machines. So it's only once you start to take these objects apart can you see how important the cabinets were for trying to construct these particular games. An abrupt end to EM machine design practices and paradigms did not occur. Even one of Atari's promotional flyers for Pong, the product that revolutionized the amusement games industry, depicted the machine depicted the machine achieving liftoff, appearing to leave the old industry behind. Part 2, design history into game history. Apart from the descriptive fact-based linear accounts comprising the history of electronic coin-op machines mentioned previously, other barriers obstruct the ability to research this history, and in particular raises problems for the design history of game artifacts. Materials that document the history of arcade cabinet design are only now starting to find their way into cultural institutions. I've been working in such collections at Stanford and at the Strong Museum in Rochester. Research is delimited by those collections. Hence, the company Atari plays a large evidentiary role in the history of coin-ops until materials from other companies enter into the care of cultural custodians, if that's even possible. A workaround to archival bias is to consult resources provided by antiquarians, enthusiasts, and private collectors of coin-ops. While we can observe a computer space at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, we are less likely to behold a Boot Hill or EM machines. No, many of these institutions do not collect electromechanical games. To work with cultural original designed artifacts and not just stare at promotional arcade flyers online, researchers must travel to annual events like California Extreme, visit independent micro-museums like the American Classic Arcade Museum in New Hampshire, or rely upon the generosity of private collectors. Researchers at museums typically only work with a tiny representative sample of existing coin-op artifacts. Less popular machines with shorter production runs compared to, say, a Miss Pac-Man are not only trophy items in private collections, but in the context of research can, as they have here for this research, offer alternative models to gauge game history, providing advantage of difference against the prevailing continuum. In Game After, I followed Hutamo to claim that we are now experiencing an era of collection to help counter the generalist descriptive survey of game history that was not able to benefit previously from the amount of historical materials increasingly available. More materials from which to compose history, however, does not guarantee more rigorous and critical historiography. As Victor Margolin argued over 20 years ago in his appraisal of design history, the expansion of design history subject matter since the mid-1930s, when Pevsner published his Pioneers, seems to be just another redrawing of the design map. What is needed instead, as Margolin asserted in his polemics on design history, is a radical rethinking of the discipline. I have flagged the field of design history as formative of my research and not just design, primarily expressed in game studies as software development. The reason for doing so is that a correlation exists between long-standing disciplinary debates within design history, design studies, that have proven influential in shaping contemporary scholarship and the current state of historical study of games, within which scholars of game history are now beginning to move away from the era that Hutamo labeled as chronicle. Researchers of game history may be on the verge of having to confront the dilemma of the history of games being one possible area of research within a broader field of game studies that has been slow to turn its attention to critical historiography, or game history as a specialization within historical scholarship, a mixed disciplinary era drawing its methodologies from the various fields mentioned at the beginning of this talk. A more broadly constituted game history is certainly desirable, especially when attentive to the field of design history. It is my intention that the emergence of a critical historical study of games be counted among those new topics, theories, and methods invited to the so-called design historical table that Chettle Fallon has set as essential to keep the discipline dynamic and vital. So far, the study of video games, even with an emphasis on the history of technology, has not made much of a dent in either design history or design studies, judging from the lack of work included in journals and books in the field. Ideally, the design historical table would be a multi-course setting, with design history also nourishing the critical historical study of games, as I have tried to demonstrate via surfaces really scaled by both game studies and design history. I find it unbelievable that a recent book that came out on, I think, the 50 icons of design would not include the Atari controller or the Nintendo Wii, or would not include the Nintendo gamepad, that games seem to be outside of these kind of list of great designed objects. I just find that baffling. I mean, the Coke bottle's there, so you could have a game system somehow. Adding neglected objects or forgotten histories to the field of game studies may still be yet another instance of redrawing the map, as Margolin rightly cautions. A radical rethinking would place a hard emphasis on history in game history, as well as pluralize the singular so that histories of illustration, package design, graphic design, commercial art, and industrial design become central to our thinking of how game design can matter. Hutamo's insistence that game historians position arcade video games within the history of electronic amusements has helped magnify design practices extended from late 60s EM machines, as I've done here, to arcade video games from the 1970s, while also highlighting how Atari's design practices attempted to outstrip the older coin-op amusements for its new medium. But rather than remain focused on histories of amusement devices like Hutamo, it is increasingly apparent that to compose a design history of game artifacts, we must look beyond games altogether to the history of design. Allow me to fold back to Kurtz's opening lines on Computer Space, when he said that everything changed in 1971, when a strange-looking game began to appear in arcades. Would Computer Space, or Pong for that matter, appear as strange in Matti Saranen's Futuro house, one lit by Vernon Panton floor Penthella lamps, or a bright orange Nesso table lamp designed by Giancarlo Mattiolo, seating like Gaetano Pesci's Syria Up or Olivier Morgaux's Jean Chair, with ambient music playing through consumer electronics like a Weltron 2001 Spaceball 8-track player and a Motor Film Special's black and white TV humming in the background. Game historians looking inwardly at the design of their artifacts cannot see other Cold War era products embodying a post-atomic age, late 60s to mid-1970s design zeitgeist of experimentation and playful forms, colors, materials, and optimistic futures come psychedelia, come late modern or early postmodern pop aesthetics. That's a lot to say in one sentence. Applied in the vibrant plastics of Aero Arneo's Pastille chair and a Panasonic Tudaloop transistor radio. Without design history, game studies' treatment of its own design history is doomed to vacuous analogies. Computer Space as futuristic, a 1957 DeSoto, or prop from the sci-fi film Barbarella. These are all statements that game historians have used when describing the game Computer Space. A game history informed by design history would not settle for analogy, but would provide reasons for why they are drawn in the first place. Thank you.